This is the Dollemore Daily, and I'm Jesse Dollemore. For months, if not years, I have been warning of the risk to our democracy. That the fears that I held, that I still hold, culminated on January 6th, 2021, with the attempted overthrow of our government. The failed coup attempt by white nationalist Trump supporters who culminated in Washington, D.C. to attack the United States Capitol in an attempt to stop the certification of a free and fair and settled American election, to try to keep their guy in power. I talked about it a bunch, but remember, after Donald Trump was elected, there were marches and protests all over the country to voice our concern. I took part in those. To voice our concern, to lift our voices as one in a collective, to say, we're not going to sit down while you destroy our country. We realize you won fair and square, but your agenda will not be tolerated. That's what it was about. It wasn't about overturning the results. I mean, if you want to put it in a crass way, it was bitching about the results. That's not what happened on January 6th. January 6th wasn't a protest about the results. January 6th was an attempt to overturn those results. It was not redressing their government. It was attempting to overthrow the government, to install their guy who the American people resoundingly rejected. This is where we are in America, where our democracy is in very real peril, threat of collapse. And earlier video today, I talked about the Republican Party's scrambling, panicked effort to try to reverse course relative to the influence of Donald Trump. Too late. Too late. As Democrats, we are now forced to do it ourselves. And part of being forced to do it ourselves is sounding the alarm and convincing everyone the real threat that does exist. I mean, if we, as a country, if we treat the threat to democracy like we've treated the threat to our planet with climate change, we're doomed. And I hope that's not the case. One member of Congress is beginning to sound the alarm, talking about the very real threat that is posed to our democracy. And that's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who did an interview with David Remick with the New Yorker Radio Hour. And she talked about the fact that in 10 years, we may not have a democracy. I agree wholeheartedly with the Congresswoman. And I want to talk about it. I'm going to read a little bit from this article, and we're going to play the audio. There's a minute and a half or 2-minute clip that I want to play that is very important, and I hope you'll listen. The article from The Insider, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez warns there's a very real risk the U.S. won't be a democracy in 10 years. Now listen, it kind of comes along with the territory, talking about politics, for people to be hyperbolic, to be exaggerative, to oversell something. It's not the case with this. There are, in municipalities and states and legislatures all over the country, an attempt to roll back voting rights in order that Republican control remain. There are hundreds fewer polling stations across the country because Republicans want to make it more difficult to vote. They don't want as many people voting as possible. That is a decline in democracy. If they can make it where they have an outsized influence in election, that's not democracy. Reading from this article, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said there's a very real risk that the U.S. will return to Jim Crow policies and won't be a democracy in the next 10 years in a new interview with The New Yorker. Quote, what we risk is having a government that perhaps postures as a democracy and may try to pretend that it is, but it isn't, Ocasio-Cortez told The New Yorker editor David Remick. While the New York Congresswoman said the situation is not beyond hope, and that is, listen, this is what I find hopeful, to borrow the word, is that oftentimes people who sound the alarm are cynics. People who are cynics about everything, and then when one of their prediction comes true, then they feel like they're some kind of a prognosticator. We are not beyond hope. But it's going to take all of us to stay organized, to stay involved, to stay active in politics, to stay engaged, to stay hopeful if we're going to win here. While the New York Congresswoman said the situation is not beyond hope, she argued that the U.S. is seeing the opening salvos of the end of democracy with a targeted specific attack on the right to vote across the United States, particularly in areas where Republican power is threatened by changing electorates and demographics, combined with white nationalist reactionary politics. And then she goes on to talk about, I'm going to play the clip here, but she goes on to talk about a return to Jim Crow. And when you hear that, a lot of people are going to say, because they imagine the worst parts of the 1940s, 20s, 30s. That's not what we're talking about. Jim Crow policies with a modern day flair could be equally as damaging and stifling to the vote and to democracy in America. And that is what Texas is trying to do. In many ways, that's what Virginia and Florida and many other states are trying to do. Right out in the open. Here's this clip with David Remick and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about the fate, the threat to our democracy.
You used a phrase earlier in the midst of this, if we have a democracy 10 years from now. Do you think we won't?
I think there's a very real risk that we will not. I think what we risk is having a government that perhaps postures as a democracy and may try to pretend that it is, but isn't.
What's going to bring us to that point? I mean, you hear talk now about being on the brink of civil war. That's the latest phrase and series of books that have come out. But what will happen to bring us to that degraded point if, in fact, it happens?
Well, I think it has started. But it's not, it's not beyond hope. We're never beyond hope. But we've already seen the opening silos of this, where you have a very targeted, specific attack on the right to vote across the United States, but in particular in areas where Republican power is threatened over both changing electorates and demographics. You have, white nationalist reactionary politics starting to grow into a critical mass. And so what we have is the continued sophistication and takeover of our democratic systems in order to turn them into undemocratic systems, in order to overturn results that a party in power may not like.
And your concern is that we will look like what nation? Any nation in particular?
I think we will look like ourselves. I think we will return to Jim Crow. I think that's what we risk.
You think we'll return to Jim Crow? How would that? What's the scenario for that happening?
Well, you have it already happening in Texas, where Jim Crow style disenfranchisement laws have already been proposed. I mean, you had members of the state legislature just a few months ago flee the state in order to prevent voting laws from being passed. We're talking about Florida, where you had the entire state vote to allow people who were released from prison to be reenfranchised.
And then she continues on with some other examples across the country. I love the thought. I love that she articulated that we're not going to look like some other country. We're going to look like ourselves. We've been there before. The Republican Party, for many, 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 many years, has attempted to roll back the clock. Donald Trump's entire theme of his campaign was make America great again. As though 1950s America was its ideal, the pinnacle, the acme of America. A time when black and brown people were otherized openly, where there were separate water fountains depending on the color of your skin. Those are the years for which Republicans, they pine for them. They yearn for those days. We will be ourselves. I hope that you have the stomach for the fight. I hope that you have the appetite for truly making America great. Because there is a concerted effort among Republicans to turn back the clock, to make your neighbors and your loved ones, and maybe you, otherized again. To make it difficult for you to vote. What do you think? I'd love to know. You can call, leave me a brief voicemail, 714-576-4054. Of course, you can email me daily at dollemore.com. I love you and appreciate you. Thank you for engaging with my content. If you have not yet subscribed, please consider doing so. Follow me on social media. You can tell me I'm wrong there. Or you can tell me I'm right too. Come on now. Everybody loves a little positivity. And if you appreciate what I do, if I bring you some value on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, please consider supporting my work. You can do so by clicking the join button below this video, becoming a channel member for as little as $1.99 a month, or you can steer your browser over to patreon.com/IDoubtIt podcast. That's not just for the podcast. That absolutely supports what I do here on YouTube with the videos. So if you want to produce what I do, help what I do, help grow this channel, and increase the reach and the effectiveness of this operation, you can do so through those two means. I'll see you next time, you guys. I love you. I appreciate you again. Until then, be genuine. Take care of one another.